At 0347 hours on June 6, 1944, 6 men from the British 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry landed 3 gliders within 47 meters of a bridge over the Caen Canal. Within 11 minutes, they'd secured both ends of the structure against a German garrison using a tactical approach so unorthodox it violated every principle in the British Army's manual on bridge assault. They didn't suppress defensive positions with covering fire. They didn't advance under smoke. They didn't even conduct reconnaissance. They simply ran straight at the fortifications in the dark, screaming at the top of their lungs, and captured the bridge before the defenders understood they were under attack. This wasn't reckless courage. It was precision violence executed faster than the enemy's decision-making cycle could respond. The operation called Dead Stick had one objective: capture intact the bridge over the Caen Canal and the bridge over the River Orne 400 meters east, then hold them until relieved by the main invasion force landing on Sword Beach 5 miles away. Intelligence indicated the bridges were defended by approximately 50 German troops from the 736th Grenadier Regiment, with machine gun positions covering both approaches, engineers standing by to demolish the structures if Allied paratroopers appeared, and quick reaction forces from the 21st Panzer Division positioned close enough to counterattack within 30 minutes. Major John Howard, commanding D Company, 2nd Ox and Bucks, understood the central paradox. Surprise required silence and darkness. Assault required speed and violence. You couldn't have both using conventional approaches. If you're finding value in these tactical breakdowns of real combat operations, a quick like and subscribe helps us continue bringing you the stories that changed modern warfare. Howard's solution was to collapse the timelines so dramatically that the enemy never completed the cognitive cycle from detection to response. 3 Horsa gliders, each carrying 28 men, would land directly beside the canal bridge at 016 hours. The gliders would hit the ground 150 meters from the objective. Troops would exit and reach the bridge in less than 60 seconds. The entire assault from landing to bridge secured was planned to take less than 10 minutes. This wasn't improvisation. It was rehearsed with obsessive precision. For 4 months, D Company trained on a full-scale replica of both bridges constructed in southern England based on reconnaissance photographs and French resistance reports. They practiced the glider landing, the sprint from landing zone to bridge, the assault on defensive positions, hundreds of repetitions, until every man knew exactly where to run, which position to hit, what to do without orders. Howard timed everything. Glider landing to exit, 12 seconds. Exit to forming assault line, 18 seconds. Sprint to bridge, 42 seconds. Total elapsed from wheels touching ground to first man on the objective, 72 seconds. The Germans defending the bridges had prepared conscientiously. Trenches and machine gun pits covered the approaches. Barbed wire channeled attackers into kill zones. Searchlights could illuminate the bridge deck. The demolition charges were in place, wired to switches in the guard bunker, ready to drop both bridges into the water at the first sign of airborne assault. The garrison commander had conducted drills. His men knew their positions, their fields of fire, their procedures. If Allied paratroopers landed anywhere within a mile, sentries would sound alarm, defensive positions would man weapons, engineers would stand by demolition switches. Standard doctrine, professionally executed. What they never anticipated was an attack so fast that standard doctrine became irrelevant. The 3 gliders released from their Halifax bombers at 6,000 feet at 007 hours. Pilots flying by moonlight, no engines, complete silence except wind over wings. The lead pilot, Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, had practiced this approach 43 times on the English replica. He knew the sight picture, the glide angle, the exact moment to flare for landing. At 00:16 hours and 20 seconds, his Horse hit the ground 47 meters from the canal bridge, skidded across the field, crashed through the perimeter fence, and stopped with the nose buried in barbed wire 9 meters from the German position. The impact knocked most of the men unconscious for seconds. Howard came to in complete darkness, momentarily disoriented, then heard Lieutenant Den Brotheridge already outside screaming, "Come on, lads!" The training took over. 12 seconds from impact, the platoon was out. 18 seconds, they'd formed a salt line. The second glider landed 200 meters behind them. The third came down beside the eastern bridge. The German sentry on the canal bridge heard the crash, saw the dark shape of the glider against the night sky, understood something had landed, but not what. His training said report unusual activity. He turned toward the guard bunker to sound alarm. Before he took 3 steps, Brotheridge's platoon was sprinting across the field at full speed, 25 men running flat out in the darkness, bayonets fixed, screaming like demons. This is the part that tactical analysts still argue about. The scream wasn't rage or fear, it was calculated psychological shock. Howard had studied German defensive doctrine. Sentries detecting unusual activity followed procedure, report and await orders. But there was no standard response to armed men suddenly sprinting out of darkness 50 meters away, screaming at full volume. The sentry's cognitive process jammed. This wasn't in the manual. This wasn't paratroopers landing at distance. This was immediate, overwhelming, incomprehensible violence erupting from nowhere. He hesitated for perhaps 2 seconds, trying to process what he was seeing. 2 seconds was all it took. Brotheridge's platoon covered the remaining distance, hit the bridge, and began clearing defensive positions with grenades and point-blank rifle fire before the general alarm even sounded. The machine gun position on the western end never fired a shot. The crew heard the crash, then heard screaming, then saw shapes running in darkness. The gunner traversed his MG-42 toward the noise. Before he acquired targets, a grenade landed in the position. The explosion killed 2 men and wounded the rest. British troops were over the sandbags 3 seconds later, bayoneting anyone still moving. The guard bunker with the demolition switches was the critical objective. 2 engineers were on duty inside with orders to blow the bridge if attacked. They heard the crash, heard the explosions, grabbed their weapons, and moved toward the door to see what was happening. Lieutenant Brotheridge kicked the door open and shot both men before they could return fire, then cut the demolition wires with wire cutters he'd carried specifically for this purpose. Elapsed time from glider landing to bridge secured, 9 minutes and 30 seconds. The German garrison was still trying to understand what had happened. Some positions never manned their weapons, others fired randomly into darkness at sounds and shadows. The quick reaction force in the village hadn't been alerted yet because the attack happened too fast for standard communication procedures. The eastern bridge over the Orne fell even faster. The platoon from the 3rd glider landed, formed up, and sprinted the objective exactly as rehearsed. The German defenders, hearing explosions from the canal bridge 400 meters west, were looking the wrong direction when the assault hit them from the landing zone side. Both bridges secured, demolitions disabled, defensive positions neutralized, in less time than it took the German battalion headquarters to receive initial contact reports. But holding the bridges was the harder part. Howard's force was 180 men, lightly armed, with no armor, no artillery, no support except what they'd carried in the gliders. The German 21st Panzer Division had over 120 tanks and 16,000 men within 10 kilometers. Once they understood what had happened, the counterattack would be overwhelming. British paratroopers dropping inland should have reinforced the bridges by 1:30 hours, but the drop scattered across 20 miles of countryside. Most units landed miles from their objectives. Some landed in flooded areas, and drowned. The main invasion force landing on Sword Beach wouldn't reach the bridges until afternoon at earliest. Howard's company was alone, holding 2 critical bridges against an entire panzer division, with no heavy weapons, and no idea when relief would arrive. The tactical situation was impossible by conventional analysis. Light infantry cannot hold fixed positions against armor without anti-tank weapons, prepared defenses, or support. German doctrine called for immediate armored counterattack to retake bridges before the enemy could reinforce or fortify. The 21st Panzer's quick reaction companies could have rolled over Howard's positions in minutes. They never came. Not because they weren't available, but because German command couldn't believe what they were being told. Initial reports said British troops had captured both bridges. This made no sense. There had been no artillery preparation, no massed parachute drop, no preliminary operations. How does an enemy capture defended bridges without mounting an attack? The reports must be exaggerated. Probably a small raiding party, maybe a platoon. Local forces could handle it. The Panzer Division didn't need to respond to every skirmish. By the time German intelligence pieced together what had actually happened, by the time commanders understood this wasn't a raid, but the leading edge of the invasion, by the time they ordered the 21st Panzer to counterattack, British paratroopers from the 7th Battalion had begun arriving at the bridges in small groups. Not the reinforcement Howard expected, not an organized battalion, just 1s and 2s and half platoons that had regrouped after scattered drops, but enough to man additional positions, enough to bring a few anti-tank weapons, enough to make any German counterattack costly instead of trivial. The German response when it finally came was cautious, probing attacks instead of overwhelming force. They'd lost the initiative in those first 10 minutes and never regained it. By afternoon, when Lord Lovett's commandos arrived from Sword Beach, the bridges were secure. The British had suffered 14 casualties taking and holding both objectives. German losses were over 150 killed or wounded, with the bridges and their demolition charges intact in Allied hands. Pegasus Bridge, as the canal crossing was later named, remained in British control for the rest of the war. The 21st Panzer Division's counterattack against the invasion beaches was delayed by hours because their direct route was blocked. That delay contributed to the failure of German forces to drive the British back into the sea during the critical first hours of D-Day. The tactical lessons from Deadstick rewrote infantry assault doctrine. The obsessive rehearsal, the emphasis on moving faster than enemy decision cycles, the use of psychological shock as a weapon, the acceptance that sometimes the only way to achieve surprise is to hit so hard and fast that the enemy never completes the process from detection to response. Modern special operations forces from the SAS to Delta Force study Pegasus Bridge as the template for direct action. Not the equipment, not the specific tactics, but the underlying principle that violence executed inside the enemy's decision loop creates paralysis more effective than any amount of suppressive fire. What makes Howard's approach so important wasn't just the bravery, though his men showed extraordinary courage. It was the recognition that conventional tactical wisdom assumes you have time for the enemy to respond and counter-respond within their defensive plan. But if you collapse time itself, if you move from initial contact to objective secured faster than standard procedures can execute, you're not fighting the enemy's defenses, you're fighting their ability to think. And thinking takes time that rapid assault doesn't grant them. The 6 men first out of those gliders weren't better armed than the German defenders. They weren't protected by superior equipment or supported by overwhelming firepower. They won because they moved faster than the enemy could process what was happening, and that speed transformed local numerical inferiority into decisive tactical advantage. The most sophisticated plan executed slowly loses to the simple plan executed so fast the enemy never gets to implement their sophistication. If stories like this fascinate you, if you want to understand the real tactics that changed warfare, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown of combat operations that rewrote the rulebook.